Amazing. How well trained you all are. Joined on the panel by John Aiken, Slade Professor, and also Professor Mark Lancaster, who is the Physics and Astronomy Head of HEP at UCL. I've asked Mark to start, so we can get to starting to answer the question that we are quite intrigued to find out other people's views and answers on. So Mark, do you want to make some points for us?
Yeah, I mean, I've got really three ways which I think science gets something from art. None of these are particularly specific items. I think the first one is inspiration and to challenge orthodox thinking. So basically, in my view, a lot of what people do in art is to be different, to be curious, to, in some ways, to do silly things, and to put it bluntly, to challenge the ideas that people force on you to move in a certain direction. I think artists are particularly good at not doing that. And science at the moment, and forever really, has been under pressure always to move in certain directions. So I think principally one of the things that science gets from art is that inspiration to essentially be different and challenge orthodox thinking, which I think insufficient scientists do. There's a lot, there's a lot of agenda at the moment with the government trying to tell scientists to do certain things. Many scientists don't want to do that, right? But in some ways you have to do it because the money's there. So that's a different question. The same is true in art, I'm sure. The second thing I think, which is a bit of a cheap shot, is that I think science gets from art quite a lot of good free publicity. So I hesitate to say that Dan Brown is an artist, but you get these doomsday scenarios and everything else about, the LHC and CERN destroying the world and antimatter bombs and all these sorts of things, which a lot of it is ill-founded, but it gets out there and it gets out in the consciousness, which I think is good, and out of that we get publicity, and I think in the end all publicity I think is good publicity, although Tiger Woods might not agree with that at the moment. And I think the final thing is that we get really a kick up the arse to think, because we get quite a lot of artists coming up to us going, well, a lot of the science you do is quite abstract, or quantum mechanics, or relativity, or cosmology, or whatever, and a lot of these concepts are quite abstract, and you don't often have chance to even articulate or think about what you're doing, or to distill it down into a way that other people can understand. And I think it's very important that scientists try and distill that down and try and understand themselves what we're actually doing and where we're going with it. And it's by people asking what are often very silly questions, you actually go further as a scientist. You actually can think about what you're doing. Science is basically based on people asking stupid questions. People asking, what happens if I wibble an electron? I think that's not really a technical term, but if you wibble an electron, what happens? I mean, it's a stupid question, but out of that you get radio and various other things. And you can ask a whole bunch of what would otherwise seem abstract questions. And people asking scientists, well, go ahead, try and explain that in 10 words, I think is very important. So I think art challenges us to think, it inspires us, and it gives us publicity.
Very clear. Thank you. When I ask you to comment just on that, just hold that in your head for a moment, and wondered if, John, you could make some comments from an artist's perspective.
Well, I was asking the same question, sort of the other way around. What does art get from science? What does science get from art? I think I would agree with Mark that what science gets from art is, one, interest. We're interested in what science is doing. I think I absolutely agree. You get a lot of waywardness and transgression and otherness. And I think those are all ways of actually engaging in this conversation in a very dynamic way. The question might be very naive to begin with, but in my experience with our students, it very rapidly moves into a much deeper level. It actually comes up with real solutions to things as far as the artist is concerned, and real solutions as far as some problems that they've been negotiating in their head, but they need a second opinion, or a third opinion, or a fourth opinion. I think there's a lot of other things which are interesting, just to go back in terms of the history of the Slade, because the Slade was set up as an art institution for the study of fine art within a multi-faculty university. It was very specifically endowed to be in this institution, UCL. And that was very much against the norm for art institutions in Britain at the time. The Royal College was very specifically set up to service the needs of industry and design. The Royal Academy is the Royal Academy, but there was a very different setup here. And I think it's particularly interesting when we had one of the most famous Slade professors, Henry Tonks, was a scientist and a doctor first, subsequently became an artist and became a very strong collaborator between how art and science can, in a practical sense, relate to one another in a very positive way. And the work he did on facial reconstruction surgery after the First World War was really pioneering, not only in terms of the science of that, but also if you look at the documentation from that period, the fact that the photographs, the black and white photographs of these horrific injuries that the soldiers sustained during the First World War are very emotionless and actually rather challenging and abject. But the pastel drawings in particular that Tonks did really give these individuals a great sense of humanity and pride in a way. They really, the photographs are just analytical, but the drawings do exactly the same thing, but they're doing much, much more. And I think that relationship really set something up which has been maintained right throughout the last 60 or 70 years of the Slade's development as an art school, but also its development and how it relates to University College at large. I think it's also interesting that the first brain scan imaging was done at the Slade on a mainframe computer funded by the Leverhulme Foundation in the late 70s and early 80s. And this was something which was really just an artist's, 3 or 4 artists' interest in the new technology of computers and how that could be applied to particular ways of medical research. This series of collaborations and developments that have gone on in parallel, also knitted together, is something which I think is really a constant source of inspiration for artists. Many of our students who apply state that they're applying because we are part of University College, and that's what gives them access to things that if they went to a straight art college they just wouldn't have. We've got at least 3 current PhD students that are working very closely with scientists in UCL and in some cases beyond UCL. And that's looking at the intelligence of plants. Eleanor's working with technical processes of spider webs being and their adaptation for sculpture. And we've also got one other one who I've completely forgotten and can't read my own writing. So I apologize if they're here. Speak up. But also we've got another member of our research development program here, Wayne, who's been very closely investigating for at least a year all of those aspects of science that can actually inform his research into sound, into music, into how the architecture of space through music. And he's been working with just about every department in the university as far as I can make out, so he's very proactive. So I think it's embedded in a peculiar way. It's embedded in terms of one, I think this notion of interest is really important. I think what does art get from science? It gets information, it gets collaboration, and you used the word inspiration. I think art gets inspiration from science as much as science might get inspiration from art. I think there is a large degree of naivety out there in both the scientific world and the art world in relation to each other, not in relation to their own practices, obviously. And I was rather alarmed. I did, as you have to do these days, go online to see look up art and science, and number one, the people that own the domain name artandscience.com is a hair salon in Chicago, and quite a upmarket hair salon in Chicago. But actually, when I thought about it, I thought this is ridiculous, and then I thought, well, actually, a hair salon does mix art and science remarkably well. It does a lot of investigation.
I've seen some awful haircuts on scientists.
I've seen a lot of awful haircuts everywhere. But the second one is Art Plus Science, and that's a beauty salon in Philadelphia. So it's clearly deeply embedded in contemporary culture, the whole notion of art and science. I chair a once-a-year committee which is multidisciplinary to judge the research images as art competition here at UCL. This is something which is becoming increasingly prevalent around the globe in universities. And when I was asked to chair this, I said, well, let's take it a bit further. If we have art as research, research images as art, let's have art as research images as a sort of counterpoint to that. And this was actually challenged in quite an aggressive way by one of the scientists on the panel who said art cannot possibly be research images. And we did have a big discussion about this, and I think we won. And I hope he's not here either, but he was removed from the panel the next year, not at my bequest. Behest. So I think there is a lot of, in my view, a lot of space for this to develop in much more important and meaningful ways. And that, for me, is the challenge in a way, how to make it meaningful. How to make it meaningful for scientists and how to make it meaningful for artists, because there's a lot of examples of good science, bad art, or bad science and good art. I think there's also a lot of scope for things which may not at first appear to be self-consciously dealing with this notion of art and science, but actually from a rather kind of almost underground way, something emerges that's got some form and substance to us that can be developed. I think certainly it's something which there's a much greater awareness that art is actually a very broad-ranging subject now and not a narrow definition. Over my last 30 years here, I've had a lot of scientists come to see me to talk about their art and their concept of art, but I haven't had any artists come in to talk to me about art, to say this is my science. It's a kind of something which is almost, there's a kind of attitude sometimes amongst several very important scientists that they're very good artists as well, and they're not in terms of the art they showed me. But I think there's very few artists would go and say I'm a very good scientist. So that's one issue. I've talked enough. There should be questions. Sorry.
I think you've provoked some questions, surely.